Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and start this up. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Ramphos, and I'm with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. I'm going to be moderating this session this morning as well as speaking. I'm not going to introduce the speakers mainly because all of our bios are in your program, so feel free to take a look at our background information. But what we're going to be talking about this morning is incorporating transportation demand management into the planning process, and we're going to start off with Brian Lagerberg, who's with the Washington State Department of Transportation, and they're piloting a new approach to planning that's focused on development of integrated, community-engaged, performance-based transportation solutions. And the effort is driven by the need to shift the agency's traditional focus on highway capacity investments as the primary purpose of the agency towards a role of facilitating transportation solutions as a tool to build and strengthen communities. And they're using a corridor sketch planning process, which is in draft, and Brian's going to talk a little bit more about that process. And with us today is also Sarah Hendricks, and Sarah is with the Center for Urban Transportation Research in Florida. And Sarah's going to be talking about development approvals and what strategies can be used to advance TDM and land development proposals under difficult economic conditions, which we recently have all experienced through the recession. And she's also going to be speaking about adequate public facility ordinances that are part of what the state does. And then I'm going to wrap up the presentation by talking about planning and TDM in the Washington metropolitan region. We take a very detailed approach in how we measure the effectiveness of transportation demand management, and then we take those results and incorporate those into our air quality planning process as well as our congestion management process. So I'll stop there because I could probably just keep talking the rest of the morning, and I just would like to introduce Brian Lagerberg.
All right. Thanks, Nick. I'm the Director of Public Transportation at the Washington State Department of Transportation. And what I'm here really to talk about is integrated multimodal and what that means and how we want to approach it in the state of Washington. It's about the organizations, WashDOT, local governments, the legislature. It's about our planning process and how we do integrated planning. It's about how we think about implementing demand management strategies, and it's about the decisions we make in terms of what investments to make to provide performance on the transportation system. But in my mind, it's really about startups. Because as I've been working in demand management since the mid-1980s, I realized that really what we are doing is creating startups and trying to integrate startups into a transportation system. And I think that becomes, at least for me, it becomes a really useful tool to help me conceptualize what we're trying to do and how we're trying to get there. And I also want to talk about corridor sketch plans as that platform for integrated multimodal planning. So let me start with an introduction. Things I'm going to talk about. I've been working 26 years in TDM, at least at the state, and I want to talk about the good things we've done. I want to talk about the better things, and I really want to kind of focus a little bit on confusing, because there is a lot of confusion. I think there's some signs of hope. I just want to touch on that briefly. And I want to present a way to reconceptualize what we're doing and how we're doing it, and finally, movement towards a different planning platform, a corridor sketch plan. So my main points really are transportation demand management works. And really, if you think about lean, in my mind, it's a waste trying to make TDM better. The value is figuring out how to integrate transportation demand management into the system. And changing our cultures, changing our planning process, changing the implementation approaches, and changing the investment structures. Because, as I said at the top, managing man works. It works really well. So making it better doesn't necessarily make it more effectively integrated into the system. Let me just talk about that briefly. Some of the good. We've been, at the state, making investments in managing demand since the 1980s. We did a demonstration project in 1988. We started a future production program in 1991. We have a requirement for least cost planning in the state of Washington at the MPO level. The state began investing in van pooling in 1998. We have regional mobility grants that support transit. We have a very aggressive van pool investment program where we invest about $3 million a year in purchasing vehicles. And we have about 3,000 vehicles on the road today. We created a market for avoided trips and actually allowed people to bid on avoiding vehicle trips and developed a process to pay for that. We redefined CTR in 2006 and made it much more about community. And we began in 2007 with an aggressive construction traffic management program, which is kind of really, in my mind, the first steps of integrating demand management into the overall system. And finally, in 2008, we created this idea called Moving Washington, which was we want to look at managing demand, we want to look at improving the efficiencies of the transportation system before we do any capital projects. So I just went through this list quickly, and it's not a complete list. It's mostly the stuff we invested in the state. If you add all that up, we probably reduce a little over 100,000 trips per day in the AM peak. So 100,000 trips per day in the AM peak over the course of those investments. It's probably more than that, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if it's 200,000. It doesn't matter if it's 50,000. Because there's really not a process to take those ideas and those impacts and integrate them into the transportation system planning and investments. That's really what I want to talk about. Through that process, though, we've learned a lot. We know that we need to understand what the performance is that we need from the transportation system. We don't know that today. Particularly if we want to think about achieving community objectives through transportation. How do we support them achieve comprehensive plan objectives? How do we support them in economic development plans? How much performance do we need in which corridors to achieve that? And is there a performance gap? We don't actually go through that process. On our highway construction, we don't do it. On transit, we don't do it anywhere in the transportation system. But we need to understand that, particularly if you want to talk about least cost planning. We want to achieve a performance objective at the lowest cost. We know that we need a set of strategies that can fill gaps. We have a lot of those strategies. I just went through some of them. We need to have a methodology to be able to select between strategies, whether it's capacity, whether it's managing demand. And we know that we need to figure out a better way to monitor performance of each individual investment. We don't really do that today. We put the capacity projects in place and let them go. We don't look at it on a daily basis and say, is it performing the way that we thought it should? What can we do to make that better? And we need an ability to adjust our investments real time. If transit's not performing, what can we do to make it perform? If working with employers isn't performing, what can we do to make it perform? Maybe we need to pivot away from it. In other words, get rid of the strategy. Maintain the mission and objectives, put in different strategies. We know we need to do those things because we've seen where we've done them, it works. We just don't have a process for that. And we need a process to build on the lessons we've learned. So now the confusing. The good, we've had a lot of TDM programs that had a lot of performance. The better, we know how to make them better. Why aren't we there yet? It's kind of confusing. For me, it's confusing. And I just want to quote Dr. Seuss because you should always do that in a presentation. But I like nonsense that wakes up the brain cells. When you see confusing things, there's a couple things you can do. You can look away from it, or you can try to understand it. And in the state of Washington, we're trying to understand it because we believe we have to. Mostly because our world's changed. But we're still structured to achieve our old objectives. And that's to build a highway system. That is our structure. We implement the projects that the legislature gives us. We build capacity. Our solutions are built more. And even though we know that that's not sustainable, that we don't have the capacity to preserve and maintain the system that we have today, we still build more. That's confusing. Why are we doing that? Those are kind of the questions that we're looking at and saying, is our planning process working? Are we making the decisions we need to make? So, signs of hope. Notice how I cleverly put these little keys down here that keeps you on track as what you should be learning? Signs of hope. This is the WashDOT strategic plan. 1 page. If you want more detail, it goes to 2 pages. But it's all good. There you have integrated multimodal. That's part of our vision. I just said a moment ago, we're still structured around capacity. But our vision is integrated multimodal. We're looking at cost-effective options. Multimodal. But even better than that, within each of these goals, each of these stars represent reference to integrated multimodal. So actually 4 of the 6 goals that we have as an agency are about integrated multimodal. So I don't know about you, but that causes me to kind of stop and say, what does integrated multimodal really mean? First off, integrated multimodal isn't really about an outcome that is multimodal, necessarily. It's more about the process of integration of the strategies and then identification of the best solution. So on some of our rural highways, it may not be multimodal, but it's integrated because we planned it together and we looked at a set of solutions and we came up with the best, least cost solution to achieve the performance that we need. Integrated is about an approach, bringing all our partners together, bringing all the organizations that support transportation together, and a methodology, figuring out how to achieve the performance we have to have in the system. It's about both modes and organizations. So I've been doing this since the mid-'80s, and it's kind of frustrating because we've gone through and done amazing things. We've bought avoided vehicle tariffs. I don't think anybody in the country has purchased avoided vehicle tariffs before. We got our legislature to buy off on that. We got the Attorney General to buy off on that. We purchased somebody not taking a trip. But it still hasn't gone anywhere. And so I'm thinking, what does that mean to me really? How do we take the next step? And so that led me to thinking about startups. Startups exist within a different context. They're different than what the rest of the world is doing. And particularly useful is the idea of lean startups. Lean is focus on creating value. So I said earlier, it's waste for us to focus on creating better TDM programs because it's not actually moving us anywhere. The value is figuring out how to apply those and have them integrated into our system so that one of the solutions that will come out of our system is the idea of reducing demand for the system to achieve that performance. And ultimately that means building organizations that learn, are able to learn, are able to test ideas and throw them out and build on them. In a startup, why I think this is important, it really says 3 things. A human institution. It's about people. Startups are about people and organizing ideas. New products and services. New ideas created by people within extreme uncertainty. So an extreme uncertainty means we haven't done it before. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We're testing new ideas. That's what startups are about. That's what we're about. The question is, how do you integrate that into the overall system? So in other words, it's not really about building better TDM strategies. It's about redeveloping the organizations that we work within and giving them a purpose that does a better job creating performance the system needs to perform. So it's helpful for me to think about, we're entrepreneurs. We're taking ideas and making them real. We're building startups. And one of the major things that I think we've missed is the business and marketing functions of a startup, not just the engineering and project development. We're all really good at engineering and project development. Turns out within TDM, we're absolutely horrendous with the business and marketing functions of TDM. In other words, the business functions, the integration of TDM into the planning process so that we actually end up funding solutions to the system that create performance at the lowest cost. We don't have that process. We focused on engineering and product development. So that brings me to the idea of the corridor sketch planning. The corridor sketches is really our first effort to take and integrate all levels of government, all modes around the idea of, are we creating the performance we need from the transportation system? It's a process for developing integrated multimodal. We have 290 corridors in the state that we're going to apply this to. We've tried it on 3.5 so far. But again, achieving our performance goals. And I think this is, you heard me say a moment ago, we don't have an ability to identify the performance that we need. That's a significant barrier even in this process. But that will become critical as we move forward. And we need to do it quickly. Things change. And when we look at our planning process sometimes, they're multi-year experiences. We have 290 corridors times multi-year. We're about 900 years. That's not realistic. We have to figure out a way to do it easier. We have to enable least cost planning so that we make better decisions, we make the best decisions we can. And really, we're about building communities. That's what transportation is for. It's not just transit that's for building communities. It's the entire transportation system is there to build communities. And what the corridor sketch plan really is about is creating a table where we can bring the organizations around it and build a complete system. I was recently at a tribal transportation planning organization meeting in Washington, and I was listening to people talk, and they said, well, the tribes seem to be invited to the table. And I'm sitting there thinking, what table are you talking about? There isn't a table. There isn't a table where we bring the solutions together around creating performance. That's what this is about. What we're focused on is, can we create a model where we support sustainability by broadening decision-making partnerships. So it's not WashDOT that's making the decisions, but we're doing that as part of a partnership with transit, with local communities, with land use decisions. It's about sharing risk between public and private. It's about engaging the private sector into our work, not excluding them, not seeing them as an opponent, but seeing them as a partner. It's about infrastructure ownership and operational strategies being integrated. We may own the highway system, but we want that highway system to support transit. We want transit to be making decisions that support the highway system. And it's about sustainability. How do we preserve and maintain a system that supports integrated multimodal? So I talked a little bit about lean startup a moment ago. One of the things that I think I've learned in my years working on TDM is TDM is disruptive innovation. And that means that the processes that we have in place, the manuals we have in place, don't work for TDM. If we're going to have TDM work, all those things get tossed out. Lean startup, that's what lean startups do. And there's actually an industry out there and a literature out there that gives us tools on how to approach that. Minimum viable product. We often want to start with the complete thing done and hand it to our customers and say, love this. That doesn't work in a startup. In a startup, you say, what's the minimum thing we can do to go test with the public, with our customers? It's a hypothesis. Will you buy shoes online? You don't build the whole structure in, you just ask that question and see how they respond. What hypotheses do we need to test? how are we going to test for them? And test and test and test. I read recently that Intuit used to have one test every tax cycle. They test on their TurboTax would test one thing. They're now testing 500 things every tax cycle. And that's where we need to be, where we're testing ideas. Take it out of the political realm, because when you're only testing one idea, it's really about politics. When you're testing 500 ideas, it's about testing good ideas. That's where we need to be. And learn what our customers value. And for me, our customers are washed up, because I'm providing a service to the rest of the department. Our customers are the legislature. Our customers are local governments. And ultimately, our customers are the people that use the transportation system to create community. I don't think we have a really good process to understand what customers value, and certainly we haven't built the business functions to make that real. That's what we're focused on in the context of the corridor service plan. So that was a lot. 28 years of thinking in 14 minutes.
Okay. We are recording this session, so what I'm going to do is ask everyone to hold your questions till the end of the panel, so that we could, and then we're going to repeat the question just so that we don't have great audio in here, so I just want to make sure that we're able to capture it. So with that, thank you, Brian, and we're going to go ahead and have Sarah.
Well, wait, that doesn't mean you can't clap, right?
So I'm Sarah Hendricks. I work at the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida in Tampa. So I'm going to talk about TDM in Florida. Florida has growth and development challenges, and it's oftentimes a debate between economic development versus regulations that foster quality of life. And so we have a political climate of the last 15 years that has been hostile to growth management. We've been kind of backsliding away from development regulations that might support true production strategies. So we have, in the early 1950s, we have mosquito control, and we have air conditioning, and then we have affordable private automobiles that the middle class could purchase. So this began the influx of people moving to Florida in large numbers. Florida also has a very flat topography, so we have been building roads that are wide, straight, and fast. So these elements have fueled suburban sprawl. Tampa Bay is, where I live, is considered one of the most pedestrian and bicycle unfriendly places in the United States. The photograph on the left is a typical multi-lane divided highway in the Tampa area. You see the bike lane and no bicyclists. And so our population in the state of Florida, we have about 19.3 million and growing. For the third most populous state, I think we just passed New York State in terms of numbers. We're among the 10 fastest growing. And so we have a lot of people, but we have a low population density. So we have a lot of towns and medium-sized cities. We have trips where they start out in suburban origin to a suburban destination, which makes public transit very difficult for public transit to serve those kinds of trips. So we have a higher than the national average in drive-over rate. So a little bit of history in Florida. In the 1950s, there were some corrupt real estate practices. People in the northern states, and really all over the world, wanted to retire to Florida. And so they purchased property in Florida without coming down and taking a look at the property first. And that sounds amazing to us right now, because we all hop on airplanes and go here and there. In the 1950s, people couldn't do that. And so people bought the property, looking at these beautiful brochures and photographs. So they retire, come down to Florida to find that they bought a plot of land that's underwater. Or it's in the middle of nowhere, there's no roads, there's no utilities, no electricity, no public services. So this actually happened quite a bit. And also in the 1960s, there was a growing environmental awareness because Florida has such a fragile natural environment. And so this culminated in one of our landmark state laws, 1972, the development of regional impact. was created. So these are for large developments meeting certain size thresholds where there's a multi-jurisdictional impact and requires it triggers a regional review process of all the involved stakeholders. And then in 1985, we had our Growth Management Act that requires local governments to conduct local government comprehensive planning and to adopt land development regulations that implement those comprehensive plans. And so land development has to conform to the local government comprehensive plans. And what you see here is kind of the poster child of development in the 1960s, Cape Coral in southwest Florida. So all these, a lot of dredging, a lot of canals, creates a road system that's very hard to get around. A lot of bridges over all these little canals, and you have to maintain all these bridges. So it kind of gives you a flavor of the kinds of problems with this kind of development. So the economy of Florida depends on housing construction. In 2005, we hit our all-time high of just under 300,000 housing permits issued. About 1,000 people moving to Florida per day. And then the housing bubble burst. In 2009, we hit kind of the rock bottom at just under 30,000 housing permits during that year. And since then, it's been slowly climbing up with the recovery. In 2013, Florida issued a little over 87,000 permits, which was about 35% better than the year before. But Florida is also a big agriculture state. There's another piece to this story. Big agriculture state, traditionally known as a citrus producer, but in the past 15 years we've suffered from a disease called citrus greening, which destroys the crop. What you see here is Bach Tower. It's a beautiful botanical garden with a tower. It was built right after World War I, a monument to peace. There's beautiful Peruvian bells. You go to the top of that, and you used to look all the way around and see for miles, well, as far as the eye can see on a clear day, citrus groves. Well, not anymore. Now you look around and you see houses. So what happens is these farmers, citrus growers that had been in the citrus industry for generation after generation, they can't make a profit anymore. So they want to get rid of that land. So they're selling hundreds of thousands of acres of land to the highest bidder, of course, which are land developers who want to build housing. And the local governments like this because they want the property revenue. They're suffering now as well. So, and then in addition to that, the voter sentiment is very anti-tax. We had in 2010, Hillsborough County, which is where Tampa is, where I live, we had a referendum for a sales tax that would have started a light rail system in Hillsborough. That was voted down. In 2011, our governor turned down over $2 billion worth of federal money to start a high-speed rail system that would have connected Tampa to Orlando. That would have been the first segment. And that surprised everybody because that had bipartisan support, but he argued that it was too much of a tax burden on the state. And so most recently, in 2014, Pinellas County, which is on the Gulf Coast where St. Petersburg is, they had a Green Light Pinellas campaign that if it had passed would have also funded a light rail system. And their approach was to move away from property taxes and more towards a sales tax that would focus on the revenue generated from the tourism industry. Well, it was defeated. So many local governments are prioritizing economic development with growth management taking a back seat. But planners would argue that growth management regulations support long-term investments in economic sustainability, but that quality development costs more money up front. So in 2011, the Community Planning Act was passed by our state legislature. Among many things, such as emphasizing private property rights, it also did away with something called transportation concurrency. It made it optional to local governments. Concurrency is the word that Florida uses for adequate public facilities ordinances, which means that public services and facilities need to be in place at the time of land development. And that's the concurrency came on board in local comprehensive planning to address the corrupt real estate practices of years before. But it also, the Community Planning Act also removed state oversight of comprehensive planning at the local government level. It raised size thresholds for developments of regional impact. So it loosened some of the growth management controls in Florida. So despite a hostile political and economic environment. Local governments are still doing their local government comprehensive planning. Today it emphasizes more livability, quality of life, sustainability, and trip reduction programs and strategies align very well with those kinds of planning policies. So trip reduction programming in Florida is primarily regional commuter assistance programs that are funded through the Florida Department of Transportation. Trip reduction is commonly cited in land development codes of local governments, but they're almost never mandatory option that can be used. So what local governments do, what they have been doing, is emphasizing capital facilities construction for bicycle, pedestrian, and transit facilities using urban design standards. We also have something called a multimodal transportation district that had come about as a kind of a variation of transportation concurrency that prioritizes the safety and comfort of the pedestrian over automobile travel. It's now used by some governments primarily as an urban design standard. We also have sector planning, which is optional. This came about in the early 90s to address suburban sprawl and piecemeal development. It addresses regional issues through something called detailed specific area plans. So you have several detailed specific area plans that make up the larger sector plan. The idea is to balance development with agriculture and environmental sustainability. These sector plans would look at a parcel that is at least 15,000 acres in size. It allows for non-urban service area master planning. And so this is a big topic of debate in Florida right now because the farmers are selling their land, hundreds of thousands of acres. So we have a lot of proposed optional sector plans out there looking to develop these rural tracts of land. And environmental groups are up in arms, the Audubon Society is saying, look, your feasibility study is not properly looking at the environmental impacts. The state legislature this spring is considering a bill to loosen some of the sector plan requirements. So that's kind of the environment of there. We also have the development of regional impact that I mentioned before. That's to do with meeting certain size thresholds, multi-jurisdictional, stakeholder participation and review. Typically, these are large developments that are constructed over a period of several years, oftentimes decades. So it's done in phases that requires transportation monitoring, traffic impact studies, annual reporting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about several different cities in Florida and some of the good things that are going on. But with time constraints, I'm just going to focus on the city of Orlando because they're doing some good things. So Kiplinger named Orlando one of the top comeback cities from the recession. They're the land of Disney. So the city of Orlando has an impact fee ordinance. So this is an exaction. It's paid by the land developer, the amount of which is based on the impact, the transportation impact from the development. The money goes towards capital improvements to serve that particular land development. So we've got a traffic impact fee ordinance. Some recent amendments to that focuses on developments that choose to locate in transit-oriented districts, transit overlay districts, TODs. So they can choose now to cut their impact fee by about 20% for each criterion met, and I've listed those there. Among that are subsidizing transit passes to the occupants of the development for the life of the project. So that could be 20+ years. So presently, the City of Orlando has 9 development agreements within these transit overlay districts, 3 of which elected to use the transit subsidy. We also have a good example of a sector plan in southeast Orlando. I think that this is one of the things that's working well. It's entirely within the city. It contains the Orlando International Airport. And so in this area of Florida, tax revenue from tourism fuels growth. They have 59 million visitors annually. A third of the workforce is in hospitality and tourism. And so the Orlando International Airport is considered the only major airport in Florida that is capable of expansion. So they want to capitalize on that by developing airport-supportive land use around the airport area. So the sector plan also includes what they call medical city mixed-use activities city center. Florida is very keen on attracting medical research, hospitals, and the allied health professions to the state. So the sector plan has a master plan, an associated land development code with it, and urban design standards that are quite detailed. And so there's this hierarchy of urban land arrangements with increasing development densities and intensities going from neighborhood to village to town center. And so the aim is a balanced transportation system providing equal emphasis to pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit to reduce the reliance on the automobile. The streets are laid out with an interconnected network, blocks where the building entrances front the street, parking is in the back. The access to the parking is subordinate to pedestrian access. Bicycle and pedestrian connections between parcels. Public transit connects one neighborhood to another and connecting the neighborhoods to the outlying region. They also have performance measures like an accessibility index, which is the percent of households employees in mixed-use centers. They're served by bicycle facilities and transit facilities. And Orlando recently did a geographic information systems analysis that showed that 75% of the households in the sector plan are served by bicycle facilities and 56% of the households are served by transit. So there's some challenges for transit because there's a trade-off between accessibility and directness of routes. And also, pedestrian urban design is sometimes at odds with transit because transit needs have wider lane widths desired. Instead of 11-foot lane widths, they'd rather have 12-foot lane widths. They'd rather have larger turning radii at intersections. And pedestrian-friendly urban design tends to try to move away from that. So there's that tension there. They also have a connectivity index ratio, which is a ratio of street segments to nodes. So the ratio, the standard that they shoot for here is 1.4 to 1.8 connectivity. My last example is a development of regional impact, again in the city of Orlando. It's called Health Village. It was filed in 2007 by the Adventist Health System. It's also known as Florida Hospital. And this is an example of a planning emphasis on public-private partnerships and interagency coordination. It's a 172-acre mixed-use community, anticipated 15 years to complete the construction. So in Florida, what we have oftentimes, most of the time, land developers come in, they buy property, like all those rural acres from the citrus farmers. They buy the property, they develop it, they sell it, and they get out, or they move someplace else in Florida to buy property to develop. In this case, I think this is different because the property owner is developing the land, but they're not moving. The purpose is to develop their land, move in, and develop a medical community. So they're very invested in the long-term consequences of their land development decisions and their property management decisions. So this is going to create 18,000 jobs when it's done. It's a campus that's served by Lynx bus service and also Sunrail commuter rail service. There's a station that runs through the center. This is the only privately funded Sunrail station. It cost Florida Hospital $4 million. Sunrail commuter service actually was just started recently in May of 2014, and when it's done in 2016, it'll extend over 60 miles from Volusia County to Osceola County. There's also a national nursing shortage, and Florida Hospital knows this, so they're thinking, okay, how do we attract nurses and other medical personnel to want to work at our hospital? So they provide employee benefits, including a 25% Sunrail subsidy and pre-tax benefit. Also, the campus is well placed with a lot of multimodal alternatives. It's just 2 blocks from the Orlando Urban Trail. So there was a lot of thought put into it. The city of Orlando, they really like Health Village. One of the reasons why is because it's being developed on a part of the city that has been suffering from urban blight and deterioration for many years. So they like that. This is a campus that's actually, it's a conglomeration of several specialty hospitals. They have something called, it just opened in 2012, the Translational Research Institute for Metabolism and Diabetes. They have a digestive health center, they have a children's hospital, a women's hospital, a transplant center, a cancer center, and the list goes on. With high-rise associated medical office space, they have their own college campus for people who want to study medical profession, supported retail, fitness centers, spas, restaurants that serve healthy food. So this health village was very well thought out. Also condominiums and apartments to provide close-by housing for employees of every income bracket. So Health Village is an urban infill DRI with a master plan and pedestrian-friendly design standards. And so I would conclude with my observation that we really do have a lot of good planning laws and tools in Florida to support growth management, and trip reduction strategies and programs and services is a part of that to make growth management successful. But to be successful, it really needs the support of the political leadership and the voters. So in a political environment that's hostile to regulation and not amenable to development agreements that stipulate ongoing TDM programs and services, the fallback is a good land use design and capital improvements that enable people to walk, bicycle, and ride public transit. So for now, that's mainly what planners have to work with. And I think that the future TDM programs and services can build upon this a built environment that supports alternative transportation. So this is where the Florida construction industry and the local tax revenues that the local governments like, this is where that meets in the middle with TDM programs and services.
I'd like to just wrap up this panel by talking a little bit about what's going on in the Washington, D.C. region. As I mentioned, I'm with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. We also house the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, which is the designated metropolitan planning organization for District of Columbia, Northern Virginia, and suburban Maryland. So we have about 5.3 million residents and close to 3 million workers. By 2040, we're expecting that there'll be 4 million more trips each day in the region, which is a 24% increase over today. And the issue is that the capacity is not going to really be changed in order to meet that demand. So this is where demand management comes into play. We basically have estimated through our constrained long-range plan that overall daily travel, and this is beyond just the commute trips, will be increasing dramatically. There's probably going to be about half of those trips will be by walk bike, which has been a growing trend. We have a very robust bike sharing program in the Washington, D.C. region, which continues to expand. And the District of Columbia has actually been taking lanes away to make bike trails. This has not been very popular, but it's been popular with the cycling community. But some of the automobile advocates have not been overly enthused with that. But nonetheless, my feeling is that the district has taken a pretty huge leap into the bicycling planning, and many of the local jurisdictions have also been starting to do that. Not so much bike, taking lanes away, but expanding on the bike share concept. Transit trips are also projected to increase by about 30%. We also have about a quarter of those trips will be by HOV, carpool vehicle, and then we have about 15% of those trips will be by drive alone. But as you can see, by far the vehicle trips, in terms of sheer numbers, that's where you're going to have a lot of those trips being made. When we're looking at the commute travel, again, about a 70% increase for bike walk, 30% increase for transit, about 44% for carpool vanpool, and about 20% for vehicle trips. But again, here, your car and vehicle trips, again, are going to far outweigh what you're getting in transit and in bike walk. And our transit system is also at capacity. When we're talking about the metro system, even our commute, some of our commuter rail lines, there is congestion on those systems as well. And there's somewhat of a sense of frustration on behalf of some of the commuters that try and take those lines. Sometimes they have to wait for one of the trains to go by to get onto the next train, and that really causes some frustration there. So we at the Council of Governments have a very robust regional transportation demand management program. It's essentially going back to what Brian says. We have many customers. Our state departments. We have 3 state departments of transportation that we collaborate with: District, Maryland, and Virginia. We also work with the business community. We have a very robust employer services program, and we also have the seat of the federal government in Washington, D.C. So we have many federal agencies that are involved in commute planning for their organizations, mainly because they have to put together transportation management plans. Our local governments, also many of them have local TDM programs, so we coordinate with all of those local governments. And our footprint for the regional TDM program, which is called Commuter Connections, goes far beyond the TPB, the MPO's planning area, mainly because we have commuters coming from as far away as southern Pennsylvania. We have commuters coming in from West Virginia. We have commuters coming in from the Eastern Shore in Maryland, as well as from Delaware. Some commuters are coming in from southern New Jersey into the Maryland area, and then we have commuters coming up from Richmond, Virginia, into the region. So many of our local governments and our transportation management associations, some of those folks are outside of our typical coverage area. We also work very closely with our vanpool providers, as well as our car share and bike share services that are out there. And essentially what we're looking to do is develop programs that will help make an impact on congestion and air quality, because we also have an air quality issue in the region. When we're looking at these programs, however, the political reality is we need to justify the expenditures, and in order to do that, we have a very robust evaluation cycle. We first develop a blueprint on how we're going to collect the data for each of our measures and how we're going to evaluate that data. This blueprint, and I only brought one copy, but if folks are interested, it's on our website, and it's called Transportation Emission Reduction Measure Analysis Report, and the blueprint is actually a framework methodology that basically goes through every single measure, how we collect the data, how that data is analyzed, and then in the end, what are the impacts of that measure, both on the congestion side and on the air quality side. We have a very robust data collection initiative. It's a 3-year cycle. We do things like a placement rate survey, where we actually look to see of the commuters contacting us, how many of those commuters actually have made a travel behavior change. And we can confidently say that over 40% of the individuals that contact us will make some type of a travel behavior change. So whether that's going from drive alone into carpool, or carpool to vanpool, or vanpool to transit, or bike to carpool, we basically look at all of those initiatives and all of those changes, and we come up with what's called a vehicle trip reduction factor. And then there are reports that are made available as a part of that. We also collect data on our Guaranteed Ride Home applicants. One of the goals there is to figure out, is the Guaranteed Ride Home program actually assisting to retain individuals in some type of a shared alternative mode. We also have and I brought copies here in the front, so please help yourselves, because I don't want to have to carry these back. But I brought what's called the State of the Commute report. This is a report, a survey that we conduct every 3 years. We interview about 600,000 households in the region. We ask them very specific questions about their travel patterns, We ask them questions about whether or not they're aware of any of our programs and whether or not our programs have caused them to actually have the travel behavior change. We also look at attitudes and awareness towards shared ride alternatives. And we essentially use a lot of this data to incorporate it into our regional planning process. So whether that's our air quality conformity process or our congestion management process, we use the data from all of these reports to basically bubble up into a final report. And then we share those results with our planners, within the MPO. We have a lot of modelers that are interested in this data. We have our air quality planning group that's interested in the data. All of our state DOTs, as well as many of the local governments, use this data for planning purposes as well as forecasts out into the future. So the overall objective is to estimate, again, the effectiveness of these programs. And the programs I'm talking about is we have a telework program where we assist employers to either start or expand teleworking. Currently, we have about just a little over a quarter of our workforce is teleworking at least 1.3 days a week in the region. As I mentioned, we also have a guaranteed ride home initiative. So we basically use this program as an insurance policy to basically convince folks that, hey, it's okay if you don't have your vehicle at work. And particularly if you're in the urban core, you have a lot of other options. So if you have to go to a business meeting, you have car share, bike share. We have a great transit system. Now we have, if you don't want to take a cab, you can take Uber or Lyft because those are now all legal services in the urban areas. As well as the entire region as we speak. And then if none of those work, then we also have the guaranteed ride home program. You call us and we'll get you back to your vehicle. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, a very robust employer outreach program. We have about 10 what I call sales territories, and each of those representatives in those sales territories are responsible for going to these businesses. And we're primarily focused on companies that are private sector, 100 or more employees, and working with them to either start or expand TDM programs that are employer-based at their work site. So that can include things like preferential parking for carpools and van pools, offering the transit benefit, looking at incentives for carpools and van pools, telework, flexible work hours, alternative work schedules such as compressed work weeks. So basically the entire gamut of all of the strategies. And then we have a mass marketing initiative where we're actually expending dollars to educate the public. It's a very transient community, transient region. We have a lot of folks moving in and out of the region. So our goal is to continuously have a message out there to let people know that this program exists. And then we also have our operations center, which is kind of the hub. We have a call center, and then we also have a very robust website where folks can actually contact us and ask questions and get information on all of our program services. And then, as part of this, we look at all of the overlap because many of these programs have synergy with one another. We want to make sure that we're not double counting the impact. So as part of the evaluation, we took a very focused look at what impacts are specific to that measure, and then any overlap, we either discount that overlap or we put it into the appropriate measure that it goes to. So for instance, with telework, you may have employers that are part of our employer outreach initiative, but yet they also have a telework initiative going on. So we want to make sure that the telework initiative takes precedent over the general employer outreach initiative. So when we do our survey, we know that teleworking is one of the more robust measures that that particular employer has taken on. Okay, so when we're looking at the performance continuum, we take a look at things like awareness, the modes and the programs that are being used, what are the attitudes, much of that we collect through our State of the Commute report, and then what is the participation that is going on for each of these services, and are folks satisfied with the program? So beyond just the data collection for the impacts on transportation and emissions, we also want to find out, are these programs working? Are people satisfied with them? What can we change? What can we make better? So those particular results don't necessarily go into the planning process, but it's valuable feedback for us in order to make adjustments to the program. And then we look at, again, as I mentioned earlier, travel changes and then what influences those changes. Because a lot of that drives how we're going to market the program. So for instance, we know that one of the motivating factors is time savings. And so when we're going out to do our marketing message, we're going to use some type of a time savings message, particularly if there's an HOV lane or an express lane that might be available. We're going to use that type of a messaging as part of our marketing. And then we also look at the impacts, travel, air quality, energy impacts. When we're looking at the overall process here, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but we come up with a placement rate. As I mentioned earlier, we have a placement rate survey. That's kind of our baseline, and then from there we take a look at how the vehicle trips are reduced, and then how the VMT is reduced, and then what types of emissions are reduced. And so there's a whole calculation that we use, and it's specific for each measure. So some measures, it's very simple to basically come up with your overall placement and then calculating your vehicle trips and vehicle miles of travel. But in other cases, it's not that cut and dry. So for instance, with employer outreach, we have a regional CRM that we use, so we have to basically call through all of that data. We have probably about 8,000 to 9,000 employers that we have to take a look at to see what level they're at. And then we actually use EPA's commuter model to come up with what the impacts are at each of those locations based on what types of programs they've put in place and how, at what level is that employer offering those programs. It's great to say that you have some type of a benefit program, but if you're not promoting it and you don't have a lot of participation in that program, chances are you're not going to have a high impact for that program. So we take a look at each of those factors, and then we take a look at things like transit access. Are there specific incentives that are being offered? Is there a monetary benefit that this employee would get if they participated in the program? And then how does that all bubble up into the overall analysis for employer outreach? So that's just one example. So after we collect all of this data, we have set goals for each of these measures. Each strategy has a goal, and then we have collective goals. So what I did here is basically showed you what the collective goals are. So as you can see from our last evaluation in June of 2014, we had a 20% increase in the trips that we reduced, and these are daily trips. Same with the vehicle miles of travel that were reduced. For NOx and VOC, we had negative impacts, and I will say the reason this is negative is because our emission factors in 2015 changed because we had a shift from our Mobile 6 model that the EPA had to the MOVES model. So the change in that really forced numbers here. And in and this isn't a bad thing, because I think in reality what it did is basically gave us the true picture of what was happening. The MOVES model is a little bit more granular, and it kind of gives you a better picture of what's happening in the region. So the analysis is that we met our collective goals for VT and VMT. And then we also did not meet the emission goals, as I mentioned earlier, because the goals were established back in 2005, and we were using a much different model back then. So I'm just going to quickly, the next few slides are just some trend lines. And we started this analysis back in 1999, and we do the analysis every 3 years. So as you can see, with the daily vehicle trips reduced, it's continuously gone up through 2014. And these are our daily, again, daily, so we're basically reducing 131,000 plus daily vehicle trips from the program. Same with the VMT, it's about 2.4 million. And then with the NOx, we peaked back in 2002, and then there was a slide there, and then with 2014 there was a little bit of a bump. And I think many of you already know, you may know the reason for this is because vehicles are getting cleaner. So our capacity to try and get more NOx reductions is hampered by the fact that the technology in vehicles has made it a little bit more difficult to get to that level. So, and I think now also with the new MOVES model that we used in 2014, that also adjusted. There was a little bit of an adjustment there as well. Same with VOC. The peak was back in 2002. A little bit of a decline, but it's now just kind of flattened out for 2014. Although we don't have to collect information on greenhouse gas emissions, we do. There is no requirement to do so, although we have been, as a region, there have been goals set on, not on the mobile end, but on just other point source types of emissions that are needed. And there's been some kind of a political push to get the transportation sector to basically come up with some type of a goal. Our Council of Governments does have a goal for the region, so for 2050. So we're kind of just working through that these days. We have a multi-sector transportation group that's kind of taking a look at this. But in any event, we have been collecting information on PM 2.5. So as you can see, in 2014, that increased. And again, I'm attributing this to the change in the model, and it made it a little bit more granular, and you can get a better picture of what's going on. Same with precursor NOx reductions. Those have gone up slightly, and then we also had greenhouse gas emissions, which is CO2, and that went down just ever so slightly, but again, I think that's due to the MOVES model. So, in terms of the role of TDM in the regional planning process, air quality conformity determination, we provide the major impetus to that in terms of our contributions for each of these measures. And it's part of our annual Constrained Long Range Plan and Transportation Improvement Program. We also have a congestion management process, which is required by federal law, and TDM is a part of that, and Commuter Connections constitutes the major program as part of that overall process. And again, as I mentioned earlier, some of these measures that we've been collecting data may be needed for greenhouse gas emission goals or targets that may be set for the transportation sector, that remains to be seen. But we also, in collecting data for all of these recent reports that I discussed, our State of the Commute report, our placement rate study, our guaranteed ride home applicant survey, we actually collected data on how people would have traveled if they did not use an alternative mode. And so from there, we're able to go back and basically come up with what impacts would actually be on the system if those folks had used those particular arterials or those corridors. And so we could basically come back and say, here's what our contribution is, and then depending on how the performance measurements come out, which kind of remains to be seen, we haven't seen anything yet from that. We've seen a few things, but not the main things that need to come out from the federal government. We may be able to use some of that towards MAP 21 requirements. So in terms of impacts, our vehicle trips, it's 132,000 daily, 2.5 vehicle miles, million miles VMT. Nitrogen oxides are about a ton, and VOCs are about half a ton. And then again, here's our PM 2.5. Just kind of a recap on those other slides I just showed you. And we also look at cost effectiveness, because everybody wants to know how much money are you spending, is this an effective program? So we could say with certainty that we're spending about 16 cents for every vehicle trip that we're reducing. We're spending about a penny for every vehicle mile of travel that we're reducing. About $20,000 per ton of NOx reduced, and about $41,000 per ton of VOC that's reduced. And with that, what I'd like to do is invite Sarah and Brian up to the podium, and we can open it up for questions and answers.
Nick, is all that in your report?
No, this particular report is just our State of the Commute, which is the survey. And it's just one report of many that we, and this is kind of our showcase report. So, and in fact, I'm going to pass some of these out because I don't want to.
So this,
yeah, if you'd like
so
to.
the stats you covered, all the pollution reductions and the cost per trip, where
Yeah.
is that in something else?
So that's in this transportation emission reduction analysis report, which is online. If you go to commuterconnections.org, we have a publications section. Just and all of our every single thing that I just talked about is posted there.
Okay, great.
I just don't want to have to bring a lot of paper.
No, that's good, because our state agency is looking at evaluating our program and determining the effectiveness of the travel reduction program.
Great, that's one. Okay, other questions for the panel?
Question for you, Nicholas. You talked about the congestion management process and you're integrating TDM strategies into that using commuter solutions. Are you actually, when you identify congested corridors, are you actually taking those programs like teleworking and things and tying that to specific corridors, or is that more of a systematic?
It's more systematic and it's just regional. We're just not there yet. Now, depending on what happens with MAP 21 and performance measures, that could change.
Okay.
Which is why we collected some of this upfront data just so that we have it. Other questions?
Over the years, you guys have been doing this a long time, I see. And over the years, have you seen an increase in the impact of technology on your programs, on adoption, on how people are using it?
Well, I think technology is important, and you guys may want to weigh in on this too, because I know Washington State does a lot in Florida. But you know, I've been involved with TDM since, like Brian, since the mid '80s. So when I first started in the program, we had these big XY coordinate maps, and so people would call in, and we'd have to pinpoint the starting and ending points, and then we switched to a it was the punch card system, where we were, you know, people would send in their information, and we had a, you know, this big mainframe, and we would put it all in, and it would spit out this match letter, and we would mail that off. So back then, I can remember people saying, "Oh, this is going to revolutionize everything. We're going to get more people applying." Now, I didn't really see a huge bump, other than the fact that it made our lives a little bit different in terms of how we process the information. And then, you know, the PC came along, and everybody at that point said, "Oh, you know, we have computers, so we can do a computer program." And then the internet came, and it's like, "Oh, we're going to put everything online, so we're going to get more people applying." And, you know, now everybody's got their smartphones and the tablets and Uber and Lyft, and so everyone's saying, "Yeah, this is going to revolutionize TDM." You know, I think in all honesty, we haven't seen huge shifts, and the reality of it is, if you look at census numbers, carpooling hasn't, you know, it was strong back in the early '80s, and since then it's kind of, you know, it's been on this slow decline. Transit, it's kind of kept, you know, kept some, I guess, some sense of pace, but so I think technology is an enabler, and it helps people get the information that they need. I don't think it's necessarily you're suddenly going to get a mad rush of people to basically be part of these programs because technology is there. I think it helps, and it makes things a little bit simpler, but I just don't think it's the sole answer. And maybe other panelists might disagree with me, but that's kind of my take on it. I don't know if you guys want to.
I guess I would just add, you know, of course, it certainly enables teleworkers to work from home. So that's probably a big factor.
I guess I'd say that I don't think that we know yet. We don't know the impact of the Ubers and the Lyfts, and we don't monitor them. We don't track the trips, and so it's hard for us to say, in the full context of public transportation, is it more or less? You can characterize them as public transportation. So I think that we'll know more as we become more integrated and we become more of a complete system.
I want to follow Tom's question about the technology. That typically technology, no matter it's an app or the website, typically present information, we use this. Besides that, what are the strategies that works very well to engage the travelers, to engage the commuters in the TDM program?
Okay. Yes. Well, you know, I don't think there's one strategy that's going to be one size fits all. I think you really, and I'm just going to go off of what Brian said. I think you really need to try different ideas, and that really takes some fortitude. I mean, you really, because you have the political realities of it, and I think for the folks that actually operate TDM programs, and there are some here in the audience, and you guys can speak up as well. Sometimes, you know, someone will come up with this great idea saying, "Yeah, if you do this, that'll solve, you know, the whole issue." But the reality of it is, it really does. I mean, it may be one part of it, and it might be part of the picture, but I think, you know, you have to have a combination, and that's really what we've done here. And I really like what Brian said, because trying to make these programs better may not necessarily be the panacea everybody thinks it might be. I think what needs to happen is you need to integrate this more into everyone's vernacular and how they think about transportation. Because everyone's kind of in their own little fiefdoms, and they have their own little silos, and then we're kind of left out of that process in a certain regard. So I think it's really being at that table, whether that table's there or not. Sometimes you may have to create that table and talk about those strategies, whether it's a construction project or some type of a new initiative that a community is going to be taking on, or maybe it's just a developer that's, as Sarah mentioned, might be developing a piece of land, or maybe they're redeveloping. There are a lot of initiatives that are going on out there that you really need to take a look at. There's green street policies now. There's complete street policies that are out there, and it can't just be a carpooling program. I think that may have worked back in the 70s and 80s. It's got to be beyond that, and you have to look at all aspects. I don't know if that's where I'm weighing on that. That's fine.
I guess I would just add that the more that you can better understand the different markets that you want to serve, the more you understand their transportation needs, the better you can tailor those services. As I mentioned in my presentation, medical services in Florida is a big growth industry, and health sciences and the medical industry tends to employ large numbers of people. Well, there is telemedicine, but in a lot of cases, you really need to come to work and take care of the patients, so you've got people that are commuting. So there are some very specific needs on the part of certain types of businesses, and if you can solve their business problems using transportation and management strategies and services, I think that speaks a lot to them.
I think if I were to respond, I've worked with state DOT, and we have a lot of the data for a lot of the system. And what I think we're evolving into is less of a provider of systems to analyze the data and more of a provider of the data itself, allowing the entrepreneurs, the others to develop the systems that make use of the data. So we become more of the platform that they build off of as opposed to the overall system that people use. But that's part of our strategic planning. One of our goals is really to say, what is our role with data? What is our role on traveler information? Is that a state role? Is that a local role? Is that a regional role? Is it a private sector role? And there's a lot of questions yet that we'll work through and try to figure that out.
Okay, other questions?
For Sarah, Orlando, you mentioned something about a transit sector. Is that what I'm recalling, that there were subsidies for transit?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. So,
And some of the developments you were talking about?
Okay, so the city of Orlando has a traffic impact fee. And a couple years ago, they amended their traffic impact fee to allow developments that choose to locate their developments in locations, the transit-oriented development overlay districts, allow them reductions in those traffic impact fee, the amount of the fee, if they do certain things. And one of those things is providing transit subsidies to the occupants of those developments for the life of that development. So is that
okay? Yeah, I was curious if they provide the subsidy for the people who live there or work there, or if they're subsidizing the actual system. So they're not paying for transit; they're giving their employees or residents money to ride the system.
That's correct.
So what kind of transit do they have in Orlando? My recollection is none. And I just remember from Orlando seeing this mass of people coming from the city to Disneyland at Disney World area, and they're all in cars. I'm sure Disney does something. They must, but beyond that.
Disney has its own internal transit system, but outside of the Disney theme parks, which are a little bit south of Orlando, the city of Orlando, there's Lynx, which is a bus system. There's Sunrail, which is a new commuter rail service that just started last year. The interior, or the downtown area of the city of Orlando has something called Limo, which is a circulator, and in certain areas it's free. So those are some examples.
So there is a system that if they wanted to bus,
Yes.
they could bus?
Yes.
Okay, because my experience in Florida, other than Miami-Dade, there is no transit in Florida, I'm sorry.
Right.
There's just not a lot of public transportation in that state.
Well, another thing that Orlando did too is they're thinking multimodally, and how do you connect the modes? And so Metroplan Orlando, the MPO in that area, studied the trail, the public trail network, and how to connect to the Sunrail transit stations. So they had a prioritization system that prioritized trail segments, bike lanes, sidewalks that came in within the vicinity of the Sunrail station, so that those would be the segments that would bubble to the surface to be funded first. So they're also thinking in terms of how do we connect transit to bicycling and walking.
Okay.
Quick question, this is for Brian too. Does WashDOT have a CMAQ program that works with local agencies where they can apply for projects, or is that money kind of just sub-allocated to NPOs?
CMAQ is at the NPO level. We actually have a CMAQ grant that we got from the Beach Town region, and we subcontracted out to them.
I would imagine that's a pretty big resource for TDM traffic as well.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I have just 3 more slides I want to, and this is totally outside of what we talked about, but I want to say that this session was sponsored by the Transportation Demand Management Institute, so for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is a 501c3 entity that's based out of California, and it used to be part of the Association for Commuter Transportation. There are 4 board officers. I'm the president of TDMI, and Brian's actually the vice president. And we also have representation on the board from Qatar. And really the whole mission is to establish TDM as an international umbrella group, basically sharing information on TDM globally. We have members on TDMI that are from Europe. We have some members from Canada, Australia. So we're trying to expand our reach, and we essentially would like to provide educational opportunities. One of the reasons why we're recording today's session is so that we can put it up on our website and share it with other TDM professionals who may not have been able to come to this session. And then we also have a section where we have existing research that's out there, and we're not trying to reinvent it, it's just basically a one-stop area where you can get information on research. And then we also have our website, it's transportation2.org. Again, there's TDM resource links there, there's a social media platform, and then we also recently introduced, for those of you who are familiar with LEAD, there's a LEAD module that we're trying to basically get up and running. It's essentially, we've partnered with the U.S. Green Building Council to provide it as a resource where developers or employers can go to find transportation demand management professionals who could actually assist with transportation projects for LEED certification. So we're kind of at a point now where we need people to start registering themselves as TDM professionals, so that when we start promoting it to other organizations, a developer can go there and find individual who might be able to assist them. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go there and register. And if you have any questions, just let either Brian or myself know. I know Phil Winters is heavily involved as well, who works with Sarah. So that's it. I just wanted to give a little plug for TDMI. And we did support this conference, and we tweeted about it, and we put it up on our website, and so we're excited to be here, and just wanted to let you guys know about that.
Actually, Nick, if you can send some of the announcement to me, so I can forward them to everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. That's our session.